Welcome to day 3, talking about the rhythm of Sabbath. Now, I'm not sure what comes to mind when you think of time off. Vacation time, PTO, or a 3-day weekend. For a good number of us, there is something different than our normal work-life pattern. We stop the production of our normal work life and change it up a bit. Although not all the activities that we choose on a day off or a 3-day weekend are Sabbath activities, many of them actually resemble what is meant by the Sabbath. For many, the thought of Sunday, or the church's Sabbath, is stores closed and nothing happening at all. I remember that. There's some nostalgic feelings from my childhood growing up with that. But I still contend that a true Sabbath isn't attained by simply not doing anything. Sabbath is a discipline. It takes planning and hard work to prepare for the Sabbath. Another word for it is intentionality. John Mark Comer, again quoting from The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, says it takes self-control, the capacity to say no to a list of good things so you can say yes to the best. I'm guessing that some of you may be thinking, I can't take 24 hours off. I can't even get a minute to use the bathroom without being interrupted by my kiddos. Or some of you are working multiple jobs, trying to get that degree, or caretaking for a loved one, parenting, just simply living this life that has so many pulls and distractions. This is a discouraging message. I understand that. How in the world could I pull off a day of stopping? And that is where I believe there is some good news. So I remember a handful of years ago in my small group, we were studying Sabbath, and the question came up. How does a mom with young kids do it? Moms are always on. So I conceded that there are certain stages in life where Sabbath is difficult to impossible. But we agreed that it isn't out of the question to set a rhythm of work and rest, and when possible, more time and attention can be devoted. She ended up writing and publishing a book on the Sabbath for her family with young kids. They observe Sabbath every weekend from noon on Saturday until church is over on Sunday. Now again, this is just one example of many. My encouragement is that if you can't spare 24 hours, which in truth is near impossible for me every week, try 3 hours or 6 hours or 10 hours, or perhaps tailor it to what you and your family's needs are. Pick a day of the week that makes most sense. I try to usually shoot for Fridays, but ultimately there is freedom within the practice to make it regular, meaningful, and life-refreshing. There is one thing I'm pretty confident of. If your first reaction is, there is no way that I could pull this off, I think I'm not overstepping to say it's one of those spiritual practices you cannot afford not to devote time and energy to planning and executing some sort of Sabbath for you, for your children, and for your family. Now, admittedly, even in my home, we have a hard time agreeing on how and what Sabbath is for all of us. And I share that to let you know that it isn't perfect, and it likely won't be perfect every week. But to put the effort in is well worth the refreshment and preparation for the coming week. The Bible doesn't really leave room for us not to practice Sabbath. It is part of who we are, like giving and praying and studying the Bible and gathering with other believers, serving others, and contributing to the common good. Early in the 1st century AD, Jesus was walking through a field with his followers on the Sabbath. And for some reason, more than once you'll find stories of what Jesus is, quote, doing on the Sabbath, the 7th day. The religious elite, known as the Pharisees, confronted Jesus about what he was doing. Well, what was he doing? He was picking the heads of the grain and snacking on the heads of grain, these little pieces of the wheat. They were troubled by the way that Jesus was celebrating the Sabbath. But what Jesus taught them in that moment was that they missed the heart of God behind the practice. We see this in Mark chapter 2. Jesus said in verse 27, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." What is fascinating about this little rebuke is that the first century culture is essentially the opposite of what we are facing in our culture today. In the first century, they needed to hear the second half of that command. Man was not made for the Sabbath, releasing the guilt-ridden legalism, policing Jesus from eating a snack. What we need to hear is the first half of that verse. Because in our culture, we aren't legalistic about it, and in fact, many of us don't practice it or even know what Sabbath is. We need to be reminded that Sabbath was made for man. Naturally, we don't Sabbath. We exist for eternity and need to be guided and led into the proper rhythms of work and rest. A.J. Swoboda, in his book Subversive Sabbath, wrote, "The Sabbath has largely been forgotten by the church, which has uncritically mimicked the rhythms of the industrial and success-obsessed West. The result? Our road-weary, exhausted churches have largely failed to integrate Sabbath into their lives as vital elements of Christian discipleship. It's not as though we do not love God. We love God deeply. We just do not know how to sit with God anymore. We've become perhaps the most emotionally exhausted, psychologically overworked, spiritually malnourished people in history." I appreciate the quote from Subversive Sabbath. And this is why we need to pay very close attention to Jesus' words in Mark 2. Sabbath was made for me and you. In the words of John Mark Comer, it was created, designed by God Himself. And it's for us, a gift to enjoy from the Creator to the creation, to gratefully receive. And now I look forward to seeing you in our next installment, and our final installment on this rhythm of Sabbath.